Welcome wherever you are to Lost and Found, the Radcliffe Institute's 2014 Science Symposium. We are delighted that you found us. People who are fascinated with navigation and wayfinding are often lost when it comes to academia. There is no department of wayfinding. There are no professors of navigation. There is no course on the revolutionary impact of the compass. But there is a lot of information out there on different aspects of exploration, making this an extraordinarily rich subject to investigate. Today, the Radcliffe Institute has brought together a number of talented guides to help us along this path. Our distinguished experts have come from as far as Australia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, and as near as Harvard's Graduate School of Design and the Boston Globe. We also have posters and presentations by Harvard undergraduates, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows right next door in Fay House. So I urge you to stop by during the lunch break and learn about the most current research underway related to wayfinding. And our reception, to which you are all invited at the end of the day, will take place amidst those posters as well. Our agenda today is wide-ranging, as befits the multidisciplinary nature of inquiry here at the Radcliffe Institute. We won't be focusing on any one aspect of how we find our way. Rather, we will ask, how do humans and turtles gain a sense of direction? How can we find our way with celestial navigation and wireless technology? What can we learn from the indigenous seafarers of the Eastern Solomon Islands and Google Earth? Today we'll be asking crucial questions and seeking clues in neuroscience, anthropology, evolutionary biology and ecology, technology, and more. And we will bring answers from all of these fields together to help us understand better how our minds, our fellow humans, as well as other creatures, and our environments really work. We often learn about the workings of systems when they fail. So it is as important to understand how and why people get lost as how they navigate. We can use this knowledge to address questions like, how does one efficiently deploy resources for search and rescue operations? What should you take with you on a hike when you leave your home? How might a lost backpacker increase the probability that he or she will be found? Have our navigational skills been desensitized by the pervasive use of smartphones? And we might even ask, what benefits can be gained from the experience of being lost? If you are here at Radcliffe or online, it means we have found one another. When I looked at the list of the many hundreds of people who have registered for this science symposium today, I feel that our temporary Department of Wayfinding has found its student body. We have faculty, graduate students, and students from the Boston area and as far away as Seoul National University. The disciplines represented by our audience members include astronomy, biology, industrial design, landscape architecture, oceanography, physics, and psychology. Because we at the Radcliffe Institute care deeply about having broad, meaningful impact with our programs, I'm equally delighted that our registrants include people who are actively exploring uncharted territory on land and sea. These audience members include the Dartmouth College Outdoor Program, the Maine Island Trail Association, the New Bedford Whaling Museum, Outward Bound, and guests from the United States Coast Guard. As you might expect from such a diverse audience, the titles of our participants here in the audience include professor, captain, ambassador, and scoutmaster. We welcome you all, along with pilots, sailors, hikers, students, alumni, neighbors, and friends. All welcome to Radcliffe. I would like now to introduce the person who has brought us all together with his guiding vision. John Huth is the co-director of the Science Program and Academic Ventures at Radcliffe and the Donner Professor of Science in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at Harvard. John's credentials as a physicist are impeccable. He is a member of the Atlas experiment at CERN. He contributed to the discovery of the Higgs boson. And as an elected fellow of the American Physical Society, he has served on the Dark Energy Task Force. But what makes John such a great partner for us at the Radcliffe Institute are his broad interests that extend far beyond physics to earth and planetary science, cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, anthropology, history, ancient languages, and even the sitar. John teaches a large general education course here at Harvard on primitive navigation, and as many of you may already know, he drew on all of these subjects and more for his 2013 book entitled The Lost Art of Finding Our Way. There's now a special display at the Harvard Coop that includes that book as well as others related to navigation, and you may want to stop by and explore that during lunch or at the end of the day. If you want to learn more after today about the diverse dimensions of navigation, I encourage you to return for a series of additional lectures and an exhibition, all of which are detailed on the card at your seat and on the back inside cover of your program, and it's also all listed on Radcliffe's website. We will all be guided today by John's curiosity and his omnivorous appetite for the subject of navigation, and also by his foresight. John identified this topic months ago. So you can imagine his excitement and ours when the Nobel Prize in Medicine recently went to scientists who identified the grid and place cells in the human brain, the brain's GPS, if you will. They help us figure out where we are and what we do. And now it's time to turn the podium over to the Radcliffe Institute's chief wayfinder, a valued member of our community of scholars, and the organizer of Lost and Found, John Huth.
Thanks, Liz. That was wonderful. So I don't have any prepared notes, but I'll give you a brief tour of how I ended up in front of you today. And welcome, everybody, by the way. I'm really glad you showed up, and I'm also really happy that it's sunny out for reasons I'll explain soon. I'm also delighted that we have this incredible cast of speakers here. These people are my heroes in a lot of ways because they informed me about navigation when I started to get interested in this topic. So let me explain a little bit about it because, at least for me, it was rather compelling, and you might ask why a high-tech experimental particle physicist would get interested in navigation writ broadly. So this started in Columbus Day weekend 2003, and I went out paddling in my recreational kayak and paid attention to the wind direction just because I thought it might be helpful. I was out paddling. After about half an hour, a very thick fog closed in, and I thought, oh my God, I didn't have a compass with me, didn't think about that. I'm hosed. What do I do? Well, I know which way the wind was blowing. So the coast runs east-west near my house, so all I had to do was turn north, and I could run into the coastline. So many times I was just blanked out in the fog, couldn't see a darn thing, turned north using the wind as a direction indicator, and basically handrailed my way along the coastline. Pulled up, took a shower, went out, had dinner. The next morning I went out, and the harbor master stopped me, and he said, "Had you seen two young women in kayaks?" And I said, "When?" He said, "Well, yesterday they went out at about 3 in the afternoon." I said, I was out paddling at 3 in the afternoon. They said they went out from a spot called Ayers Beach. And I said, well, yeah, that's about a quarter mile from my house. And turns out they went out when it was clear, just like I had gone out, and they got caught in the fog and were lost. And there was a large search and rescue operation that was mounted by the Coast Guard, a helicopter going up and down Nantucket Sound trying to look for them. The next day, the body of one of the women was found floating in the water, and they never found the body of the other young woman. And if you read about something like this in the newspaper, of course, you'll find it tragic, but then you'll turn the page and soon you're engaged in some other activity. But if you are doing exactly the same thing at the same time, in the same place, in the same conditions, and two people die and you live, it has a rather profound effect on your psyche. And so my first reaction was to ask the question why, as people do when you're faced with tragedies like this. But the waves in the ocean aren't going to tell you why, they're just going to splash and foam. So the next way of coping with it was a kind of obsession at trying to find natural signs that would help me in a situation like that. So I started to memorize the position of major navigational stars in the sky to the point where I could orient myself at night without hardly thinking about it. I could tell when the weather was going to change because I could see wind and cloud formations. I could orient myself rather rapidly if I stepped out of a subway in an urban environment by looking at the direction of shadows. And after about a year, I saw that I had a very different view of my environment. All of a sudden, the sun had meaning where it didn't have meaning before, and the stars had meaning. It wasn't the kind of meaning of telling me matters of life or death, but it had a kind of connection with the environment. Now, what I also found, I wasn't alone. It turned out there were cultures out there that had basically discovered the same tricks. So Polynesian voyagers would use the stars as a guide and would use a wind as a compass. Inuit in the barrens of northern Canada would use the wind as a natural compass, the way I had. And so it turned out that many cultures had used these tricks. Another thing that I found, which was rather interesting, was that the mind has a way of keeping track of location, and it's deep inside the brain. And as Liz mentioned, this was the subject of the Nobel Prize in Medicine this year, this cognitive map in the brain, which we're going to hear about this morning. One of the things that happened after that year was not only did I become more sensitive to the environment, but I started to notice the pervasive use of smartphones. So I saw people in parking lots walking around doing this, and I literally became fearful for their lives, which seems a bit irrational and would not be terribly healthy to run up to somebody at a Starbucks and push them on the shoulder and say, put that down, you're going to die. So what I did was I wanted to continue this, and rather than warn people off of their cell phones, I realized that if I could learn these techniques, it could be taught. And I wanted to actually see if I could teach people who may have impaired navigational skills to use natural signs how to navigate. So I started out teaching a freshman seminar and developed the material. And at that time, it wasn't well formed. But then I started to teach a general education course, and I realized that under this rubric of navigation, there was a heck of a lot of science and empiricism that could be taught. And another realization was that these societies, Polynesians, the Norse, the Inuit, although you might not call it science as we conceive of the scientific revolution, they had a kind of science in which they had an intellectual scaffolding on which they could hang their observations and use that for navigation. So in a sense, science has been with humans for a very long period of time, and navigation is a very good example of that. And even incorporating clues that you might not think would be obvious. So one or two examples come to mind. One is between about 600 and 1000 AD, Polynesians who had made various hops from region north of New Guinea, the Bismarck Islands, made it hops to Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, about 300 miles tops. Then they made a jump of about 2,500 miles to the north to Hawaii. And the question is, how would you know that there was land 2,000 miles away? And some of the speculation is that they followed the paths of migratory birds, and possibly golden plover. And there's some possibility that other migratory animals would be implicated. There's this mysterious phenomenon which we don't understand called underwater lightning that seems to be a flash underwater that's darting, and Polynesians use that. So there's some contact with animal navigation that humans incorporated in their schema. The other interesting issue is that navigation is kind of an internal state that we all possess, in some sense, for better or worse. And the language of navigation is something that turns out to be rather universal. So how many people have ever experienced some anxiety at being lost? Okay, right? So that's pretty pervasive. So as it turns out, you aren't alone. There is a term, at least in the Western lexicon, which is called woodshock, which basically means the anxiety of being lost. And this came up in the late 19th century, and so you're lost in the woods, and all of a sudden you panic and you run around, and which is detrimental to getting found because you're getting more lost. Turns out we aren't the only ones. The Vikings have a word, Huth, which basically means sea trouble, which is also anxiety at being lost at sea. In the Marshall Islands, indigenous sailors, if they were lost at sea, that anxiety is called wee-wee jet, and in fact it's kind of this almost disoriented state of mind, and even when they return to land, they're stored a little bit wee-wee jet-ish still. So that's just some of the examples of what I found in my studies, and we teach a lot of this in the course called Primitive Navigation. The students learn the stars. They have to go up to the roof of the Science Center. I say, what's that one? What's that one? Which way's north? Which way's south? And they do learn. So this skill set is not something that you have to be an Aboriginal and grow up with all the time. You can actually learn these skills in a relatively short period of time, which is actually very reassuring to me. As I said before, humans have perhaps used animal navigation as a way of finding clues for distant lands. And we don't know this entirely, but there have been, for example, chants in Tahiti about following the paths of migrating birds. So it does beg the question, how are animals so good at navigating with clues? Do they use different mechanisms than the kinds that we've just heard about in mammals? So we have Susanne Åkesson from University of Lund to talk to us about it. And introducing Susan is Scott Edwards, who is a professor of organismic and evolutionary biology, and like many of the people at the university, has been extremely helpful to me in answering patiently my stupid questions, but he's been very kind. So, Scott.
Thank you, John, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Dean Cohen. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Susanne Åkesson, who's going to talk to us about animal navigation. Dr. Åkesson got her Bachelor of Science in Uppsala University in Sweden, and she went on to do a PhD in animal ecology from Lund University, also in Sweden. After her PhD, she studied with Rudiger Werner, a well-known expert in landmark navigation in insects, particularly in social insects such as ants, at the University of Zurich, after which she then returned to Lund University, where she is now director of the Center for Animal Movement Research, or CANMOVE. This is a 10-year center of excellence in animal navigation with the participation of up to 70 researchers in this very focused field. I think what you'll find in Dr. Åkesson's talk is some very interesting parallels between the human world and what we heard about in the first session and the animal world. As someone who teaches and studies ornithology, or the biology of birds, I have firsthand experience with the extraordinary complexity and the multifaceted nature of the ways in which birds and other animals navigate their world. And so to converse with Dr. Åkesson about her studies is to not only travel the world geographically — she studied organisms in many parts of the globe — but to get a brief sense of just how complex and multi-layered and, in many cases, non-visual the world of animal navigation is. So very much looking forward to hearing your talk on animal navigation.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much, Professor Huth and Dean Cohen, for inviting me here. I'm very glad to be here and talking about one of the most fascinating fields of research there are on the globe. I hope you will share this view with me after this talk. Now, when we speak about animals, and especially maybe migratory birds, covering long-distance flights across the globe, we can think of the wandering albatross as one of the unique examples where a bird has adapted to actually move across open ocean and to manage an environment which are extreme in many senses. They inhabit islands around the Antarctica, where we have the most extreme wind conditions and weather conditions, and still they are able to return to very isolated islands where they are breeding. And we could also think of other birds which are actually adapted to survive the winter in very sedentary places like the nutcracker you can see in the picture here. There's a species inhabiting Scandinavia and Sweden. They are surviving in a very restricted space in their territory over the winter by storing 10,000 to 15,000 nuts in the autumn. However, they are extremely good at memorizing the locations of the nuts, and they explore them throughout the winter for their survival, but they also use this for breeding early, because it's a very favorable thing to become born early and to explore the environment at an early stage, and you can compete with other conspecifics. Now, they can recognize and memorize and recall these places more than 90% of the caches they recover. And the thing is, they do that in deep snow. So the capacity to actually memorize and explore the environment and to move around and navigate is fantastic. And those two examples are just a few. Now, questions we may ask if we think about migration and movements in animals is, for example, how do animals find their way in flocks or alone? And wildebeests are also migrating across the savanna, exploring the seasonal variations of the food resources. It's very important for them to actually be able to change habitat across the year. Others are exploring the islands for breeding, for example, or in this case, Ascension green turtles. They are returning to this very isolated island in the middle of the South Atlantic to mate. However, they do that after maybe 30 years of their life. They are born here, they migrate for the first time, and they return here. And what type of information do they actually use? Can we understand something of that today? Others have to face extreme situations with weather and winds and maybe fog, and they still need to know where they are and how to find the way. And maybe the basic question is, how do adults and young navigate, and how do they actually learn to handle the situation of navigation and migration across the lifetime? This is an example of the Latian albatross at Midway. Now, I would like to bring you along on a journey on some of the different questions I've been fortunate to work with in this field. And I would like to start off by introducing the wandering albatross. And you know, we still miss a lot of information which is basic for our understanding of what animals are doing in the wild. And this is one example where we were interested to investigate by using satellite telemetry and other tracking technology to find out how the first migration is performed by the young wandering albatross. And they are breeding on isolated islands around the Antarctica, and we were studying them on the Crozet Islands. And you know, the wandering albatross takes more than a year to feed the young on the island, and they breed only every second year. Now, the adults are feeding the young, so it's increasing in weight, and they become very heavy before they depart on the migration. Now, the parents are leaving the young on the island to take care of itself. It needs to learn how to fly, but also where to go. It's never guided by the parents, so this is something which is inherited. It's a program, a genetic program inherited from the parents that will guide these birds, the young birds, across the ocean, but also to manage to come back to this island maybe at 7 or 10 years of age, where they are sexually mature and start to breed themselves. Now, what do the albatrosses do? We were putting satellite tags on them before they departed on migration, so they are fairly large birds, as you know. And we were able to compare the behavior of young and adult wandering albatrosses with similar technique. The first thing the young do, they wait on the island, they start to practice flying, and they take off from the island and land on water, and they may sit there for a few days to up to maybe a couple of weeks before they depart. But when they take off, and on the first journey, they fly towards northeast. And they are doing this for some distance, covering the subantarctic front and the subtropical front. And then they start either to wander around in various directions or perform very elongated long migrations. Adults are leaving the island after breeding in very different directions. So they seem to be inherited a consistent migratory direction from the island. Now, they were not just sitting around doing nothing. They were actually paying attention to the environmental cues from winds. So they were looking for the best wind situation for them for managing the departure. So in these graphs, we show that in all days, the predominant wind direction comes from west to Crozet Islands. And the day before the island, they were persistent in the same direction. But at the point of departure, they took the opportunity that when the wind changed to southwest instead. So somehow in the program, they have an adaptive ability to actually cope with the environmental situation that will benefit their migration the best. Now, it's not just that, but if we look at the destination areas of the young wandering albatrosses, we find differences between the sexes. The females, they wander off to ocean areas, which is not so far away from Crozet Islands, and they are overlapping with the adult female preferences. So the females, they actually have inherited a capacity to move to these ocean areas where the adults are, the females are. Now the young males, on the other hand, they move further, more than double the distance away from Crozet Islands, and they prefer to explore areas south of the Australia, for example. All of these areas are very rich in food. It's good for them to be there. Now, they have inherited a program which are unique for the sex and for this species. But the question is, how do they know where to go? And what type of information do they actually use on these migrations and the first migrations? Well, we know, thanks to behavioral experiments with small birds, which can be kept in captivity and studied in orientation cages, that they have a number of compasses. They have a sun compass, a stellar compass, and a magnetic compass. And we have been able to study this for many decades now, thanks to a development of a very simple but very useful technique to put a migratory bird at the time of migration in a circular cage, measure the directional activity, and then by doing that in a controlled way, we can actually study what type of information they use. We can take away information, we can put them into conflict, and then we can start to understand the functional characteristics of the different compasses. And this is what has been done. The sun compass has a functional characteristics. It's a time-compensated mechanism included. You know, in the northern hemisphere, the movement of the sun across the horizon is approximately 15 degrees per hour. if you need or to use this information, you must be able to actually correct for this movement, otherwise you will be lost. This information is giving you directions in relation to geographic north. However, you need to experience the movement of the sun across the sky to be able to actually practically use it for navigation. And one thing is that you can, if you can detect, you can use the skylight polarization pattern to detect the position of the sun, even if the sun is maybe hidden behind clouds. Now you can see in the graph the preferred migratory direction and in what way you need to keep your course in relation to the sun at different times of the day. The skylight polarization pattern is very useful, and this is a cue and compass information that, for example, insects like honeybees and desert ants explore for their navigation. And the electric vector patterns around the sun is symmetrical, but it varies with the position of the sun throughout the day, with the sun elevation and the angular direction of the sun. Now, this is something which is a rather complex pattern to explore, but in a simplified way and by using only a part of this sky pattern, the insects are able to manage to use this. It's a possibility that also other animals, like perhaps birds, can use it. We still don't know how they can detect this pattern in their eyes. Now, the degree of polarization varies depending on the weather situation. And for example, in clear sky conditions, as much as 80 to 90% of the incoming light is polarized. It's a very strong pattern across the sky, and when the sun is near the horizon, you can see a dominating E vector across the sky perpendicular to the position of the sun, which animals can explore then. Now, in overcast conditions, and this is often what animals in the wild experience, this pattern is reduced, or the degree of polarization is reduced. But we have measured that under completely overcast conditions, there's still a few degrees of polarization coming through the clouds, but also that the symmetry plane remains of the pattern. And you can see that in the lower part of the graph showing the pattern itself. And the highest degree of polarization in overcast skies, that's apparent near the horizon. So up to 5-7% of the light can be polarized in this part of the sky. In this respect, we were also able to demonstrate that this is sufficient, for example, for the Vikings to have used their so-called sunstones to pinpoint the sun position in foggy conditions, which has later also been confirmed by other scientists. The stellar compass is not time compensated. The birds, they are able to learn how to handle this situation, and the thing they pay attention to is the rotation center, which is associated with geographic north. Experience is needed, they can learn how to memorize the star patterns. It was Stephen Emblon who did the initial work, and he has been studying indigo bountings, and this is an inherited mechanism, but it needs learning. The magnetic compass is not based on polarity, but the birds pay attention to the inclination angle, and this gives the direction to the poles or to the equator. It means by using an inclination compass, you can't tell north and south apart if you're at the magnetic equator in a horizontal magnetic field. And this is where many birds are in fact navigating or passing during migration. Now, we've been able to study, for example, how different compasses are calibrated in relation to each other. And we've seen that the magnetic compass can be recalibrated by the polarization pattern of the sky, and the birds pay attention to the part of the sky nearest to the horizon, where we have the highest degree of polarization under cloudy conditions. Now, animals can perform true navigation, we think, but to do that, it means that they need to have a map sense and a compass sense, and you have heard about the compasses already. We think, for example, that magnetic gradients, which vary across the globe, the angle of inclination varying from 90 degrees at the magnetic North Pole to 0 degrees at the magnetic equator, and the total field intensity being half at the equator compared to the poles, can be such gradients, which in combination could be used and form a global map, a bicoordinate gradient map. There are other maps. We've heard about the possibility to learn about landmarks. You can explore this in your own environment, but it's always limited in space. So a mosaic map based on landmarks is limited by your own experience. Now, if you trust a gradient map and learn how the geographic variations of this map is formed around your home, you can extrapolate this much further away. And this is something we think is a possibility, at least, for animals migrating very far. Now, if we look at what animals are doing in the wild, and this is where I concentrate most of my work, this is one example, for example, where we, by new tracking technology, now can understand the migration of the common cuckoo, who is placing their eggs in other species' nests, and for which the young has to take care of the migration themselves. You can see the initial orientation going south to wintering areas very, very far down in Africa. And in spring, they visit West Africa before they cross Sahara north again. It's a very good example of an endogenous migration program. Now, the genes encoding the migration, they need to take care of the direction, the timing of the migration, but also the distance. And included are also, in fact, the ability to fuel correctly for very long flights across barriers like the Sahara Desert. There are some other examples we have been able to collect for different small birds, and this is where we lack a lot of knowledge. We can test them in cages, but we don't know what they do in the wild. Now we start to be able to do that. The common swift is one such species migrating to Africa. It's an aerial bird, and we've been able to show the migration pattern for the first time. The little ring plover is a very extraordinary bird. It breeds in gravel pits, and in one single location, side by side, there's a number of pairs breeding. We can see the migration program represented in this population, guiding birds from West Africa and even to India. So it's a wide diversity in directions in this species. How can that be? And how is the genetics maintained of the migration program for the different species? Now, on migration, they can follow different routes across the globe. And the shortest distance between 2 points is the Great Circle route. And it's ideal in terms of use of energy, but the problem is how to navigate across these routes, because you gradually have to change your orientation to maintain or to follow this route. It's easier if you follow the rumb line, which is a constant geographic course between the 2 points. However, we can also model various other routes in relation to the magnetic field, like magnetoclinic routes or magnetic loxodromes, more or less adaptive to the birds. But so there are certainly different types of routes that we can expect them to follow. The question is what they actually do in the wild. The geomagnetic field, it does not only guide the birds in terms of orientation and giving a map sense. We have also seen by experiments that the experience of a migration or a geomagnetic field along the migration route can trigger fueling. And fueling is very important for migratory birds, of course, when they have to cross Sahara. And in this case, a simulated magnetic displacement caused an increased fueling rate in the thrush nightingales. And the birds were not translocated to Egypt in practice. They were still in Sweden, but their physiology changed due to this external experience. Now, one of the most extreme situations and challenges is maybe to navigate in the high Arctic. We know that as humans, and we've solved that, I think. But if we look at the situation up there, we have a lot of migrants inhabiting the high Arctic in the summer, exploring the environment and the rich sources of food. They leave this area in winter. Now, if we look at the situation in terms of navigation, we find very steep geomagnetic field lines. We are very near to the magnetic North Pole. We have also the largest temporal variations across the day and night in this area near to the pole, which may cause problems if you use the geomagnetic field for navigation. We also face secular variation, which means that gradually over time, the position of the magnetic North Pole will change, and animals exploring this environment has to cope with that. We have large deviations in the geomagnetic declination. This is the angular difference between the geographic and geomagnetic north, and that varies over time in this area. In summer, we have constant daylight, meaning that maybe your time-compensated sun compass may become out of phase because you don't have the triggering mechanism to keep your internal time sense in time, and you do not have any stars available for navigation. So this is an extreme environment. And this is something I've been interested in investigating, how birds can cope with that. So we've been able to perform a number of displacement experiments in the high Arctic, capturing birds, bringing them along, and studying their orientation. And the last visit was in 2005. We went to capture the birds in Russia and then translocated them by icebreaker across the North Pole area, and we were able to perform orientation experiments on ice. Now, from the breeding location to the expected wintering area in East Africa, we can calculate and predict which of the two routes, Great Circle route or the Drumline route, the birds may take. And there is quite a difference in the distance between the two alternatives. And the first location where we performed experiments at Wrangel Island, we could see that the preferred orientation of the birds suggests that they will like to take the Great Circle route to East Africa. Now, other scientists have studied the migration pattern in Alaska by putting geolocators on the small birds, and they have shown that the birds are doing something in between. So we're not sure exactly which compass they're using on these flights. Now, we were able to record significant mean orientation in a few sites, not all of them. We had natural magnetic storms in 5 occasions, which made it difficult for the birds to use the magnetic field. But in all those cases, they were able to select the initial Great Circle route in the cages, suggesting that they actually knew where they were at the location and where they were aiming. We have also performed other displacement experiments, and this is a few years ago at the magnetic North Pole, then located at Elef Ringnes Island. We studied white-crowned sparrows at the time. And we have shown by the experiments that we have a fantastic capacity of the birds to actually use very steep geomagnetic field lines in the wild, suggesting that the sensory ability to use this information is very strong. Now, by displacing birds across longitudes, we can investigate a key problem which is not yet resolved in bird navigation. And this is whether the birds have inherited a simple program, a simple clock and compass program. They keep a certain migration direction for some time, and then they may shift that later, and the clock tells when. Or whether they actually have inherited an ability to know where they are, so they can be displaced and correct for this displacement. And we did this with the white-crowned sparrows. We kept birds in Uvik, where we captured them, both adults and juvenile birds. And then we transported the other birds with icebreaker and performed experiments on the tundra locations. And we found some interesting differences between the western sites and the eastern sites in this experiment, where the birds in the western sites, they were performing similar to the controls in the breeding area, but in the eastern sites, they seemed to be correcting for this displacement somehow. And that was, in fact, present also in juvenile birds. This has been questioned in some other experiments, but recently there are some more support that juvenile birds seems to have a capacity to actually correct for longitude displacements, even during the first migration. But we certainly need to investigate this further, how they can do that. We propose that possibly the geomagnetic declination, which varies across the latitude in the northern hemisphere, could have been the information that they used, and this has been proposed earlier. Otherwise, to define your longitude, that's the major problem still in bird navigation. Latitude, you can use, for example, the geomagnetic gradients to tell how far south you are, but to cross longitudes, this is really tricky. Now, I wish also to show a few examples of sea turtle navigation. These are the animals exploring the isolated islands. And we know from behavioral work with sea turtles that they have inherited a sequence of behavioral steps to define the migration. They head off to the ocean by using visual information, the brightest part of the sky, and then they have inherited a capacity to move against the waves, and later in open ocean they pay attention to the magnetic field. And this is experiments by Ken Luhman and his group in North Carolina, where they've simulated displacement across to various locations in the northern Atlantic and found behavioral responses where the turtles are actually shifting their orientation in an adaptive way to stay within the gyre of ocean currents around the Sargasso. Now, if we are to use a map, which is probably what the turtles in the North Atlantic are using, we have a very unique possibility to study that at Ascension Island. And in this graph, you see the angular difference between the two gradients. In some areas, they are more or less parallel, the red areas. Very difficult to use a combination of the two. And in other places, there's much better situation, like the green areas. So we studied by using satellite telemetry and displacement experiments and studying the migration with magnets, how Ascension green turtles were using the various cues for navigation. Archie Char demonstrated the migration of the green turtle from Ascension Island, where they are breeding, and to Brazil, where they are feeding. They return to the island every 3rd to 4th year, where they recovered their fuel reserves, and then they migrate on and off here between the two locations. The question is how they find the island. This was what we were interested to study. We put up the 3 different ideas. They may start off from the same latitude and follow a compass course and search for the island when they think they were near. Or they may follow a chemosensory cue transported in the water current, which was proposed by Archie Char. Or they may navigate, as the Ken Luhman sea turtles do in North Atlantic. We put magnets on the head of migrating turtles. Unfortunately, it didn't disturb them at all. And they kept the same orientation as controls. We also performed displacements, where we actually translocated them, females breeding on the island, and they were aiming to come back and breed again. And we could see that they had a very peculiar pattern of searching for the island first and give up after maybe 30 to 60 days. Then some of them returned to Brazil. But the few of them that returned to the island, they in fact found the island only from one direction. So somehow they were searching for some sensory contact with the island, which they were missing if they were on the southern side of the island, but when they came in from the north. We could demonstrate that this is the direction associated with the wind. So downwind from the islands, they were able to pick up some information from wave patterns, possibly, or from infrasound, perhaps, or maybe chemical information transported in air. Now, my major aim in the last part of my, or the latest time, is to actually track the migration of an extreme aerial migrant, the common swift. It's a bird that's become more than 20 years old. It has very fast flight. Sometimes it's in 1 year's time, it can cover distances of 7 turns around the globe. And in the lifetime, 7 turns to the moon and back. This is the distances they cover. They breed in the Europe and northern Scandinavia. We are able now to track the migration of these small birds. So we can compare the migration routes and destinations in Africa from different populations of swifts. This involves that we also have to develop new technology to actually understand what the birds are doing. And one aspect of their life is that we think they constantly are on the wings from when they are born until they start to breed. And they're only sitting in the nest in the breeding time. For the rest of the year, all day and night, they are on the wings, flying and flying. This is one of the most extreme situations in terms of migration and navigation. Now, we would like also to understand more about the movements of insects, which is even harder to track in the wild. But together with laser physicists at Lund University, we've been able to develop and now start to use LiDAR to actually remotely identify insects of various size, shape, form, but also to use this technique to identify songbirds migrating at night, which is the main time of the year, or time when they are migrating. And we don't know which species are migrating exactly when and how high and in what direction. So that's something we're exploring as well. And this is an example of the various signals we can get by using the LiDAR and using them to study different types of insects. And I would like to acknowledge my cooperators and funding agencies and you for listening. Thank you very much.
My name is Eric Rattan. I'm a retired middle school science teacher. And I have two questions. The second one is a little more important. The first one is, how were you not able to determine the sex of the adult albatross in the beginning of the talk? And the second one is, and was that important, and was that unconscious within the design of the experiment? And the second question is, where exactly is the magnetic iron located in the brain, if that's so important for migration? And is there any evidence of anything like that in human brains? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I must have been a bit unclear. We knew the sex exactly of the individuals before they departed on migration, the juvenile albatrosses, but we didn't know where they went. We just know they go to the ocean, and it was not really known where different sexes were wintering in the ocean environment. So that was the new knowledge.
Excuse me, but there was an indication in parentheses of one of the adults not knowing the sex of one of the adults.
Oh, I see. No, I don't know why. It was probably not sampled, that individual, but all others were. So they were genetically determined. Yeah.
And the second question?
And the second question was about the magnetic sense itself. Now, magnetic material, magnetite, have been proposed to be one part of the mechanism, or a key source which has been investigated for a long time, and it's been found in many animals. However, it's recently been suggested that this is only part of the sense. Now, the magnetic compass sense is not based on magnetite, we think. It's more related to photoreceptors specialized to detect the magnetic field in the eyes. And there's quite good behavioral experimental support for that. The magnetite hypothesis is, it has been discovered in the beak area of homing pigeons, but recently it has been questioned whether that's not related to a magnetic sense or not. So we're still wondering whether magnetite is at all involved in the magnetic sense, and it has been the part which is detecting the intensity of the field, which has been related to the magnetic or magnetite particles, and not the compass direction itself. That's photoreceptors, we think.
Yeah, it's a very hot topic. We know the phenomenon, but the actual mechanisms are still unclear.
Yeah.
So my name is Amala Mahadevan, and I'm from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And I wanted to ask you if you know anything about insects migrating across the ocean, because last year I was on a research vessel in the Indian Ocean, 1,000 miles from any land, and we would come across dragonflies. And this really surprised me. And they were not there all the time, but they would find the ship to perch on, and then they would be gone. And
yeah, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, dragonflies are known to perform long-distance migrations, and the particular species you're interested in, I'm not familiar with, but there's certainly such example. And in the butterfly community, there's quite a number of different species migrating far. And one example you have here in North America is the monarch butterfly, you know probably very well. But we have also described the migration system of a similar long-distance migrating butterfly species, the painted lady, which cover in a year 5 to 6 generations' time the migration from Central and North Africa, across Europe, up to northern Scandinavia, and then back. And this is a very long distance, but each of the generations, they only perform part of this migration. And so there's a triggering of probably the temperature will tell the individual whether it should fly north or south. But it's a fantastic and large-scale movements of insects across the globe as well, and dragonflies are some of them. I'm not surprised you could see them across the ocean too.
And how is it discovered that individual butterflies have this sort of stepwise?
Well, we used citizen science by reporting butterfly observations across the continent, but we also are able, by, for example, the LiDAR, by our insect vertical radar, we can actually track and observe the migration of insects at very high altitudes. And some of these painted ladies, they fly, in fact, 800 meters to 1,000 meters up in the air during those migrations, and they are very selective in what wind conditions they should depart and so on. So there's quite a fantastic behavioral program that is connected to their environmental situation as well.
Okay, last 2 questions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for a great talk. I have a question about the genetic passing information for the navigation, because in both mammals and the birds, the imprinting is a very key mechanism for the young animals to learn the behaviors from the adults, from the parents. So I was just wondering, do you know, or anybody knows about whether the navigation system can also be affected by the imprinting, or does it depend partially on the imprinting mechanism for that?
That's a good question, which I can't really answer because we don't really know, I think, yet. And the simple inherited program that we think that songbirds have is that they inherit directions from parents and the distances to cover, which is related to the population-specific migration program, so where they aim, for example, in Africa. Now, imprinting or learning of routes that take place when you migrate in flocks with conspecifics, possibly, or with your parents. And there are some old experiments from North America where they actually, ducks, for example, or cranes and storks and geese, they fly in flocks, so the young can learn how to find the way. And you can see by traditional learning that they can find new routes as well. Now, if you study ducks, for example, and you separate them from parents, the young ducks also have an inherited capacity to find the initial directions and so on. But probably with time, there's a learning aspect in which other information is incorporated by learning and experience during the migration, because usually the migration are performed in a similar way between years if you have long-lived birds. But still, we don't know that too well. We need to find out how they actually do in the wild. Yeah, so I don't know whether it's an answer to your question, but it's still a question mark, I think.
Thank you. Maybe I can ask you later on.
My name is Catherine Erat. This whole process sounds like a computer is looping through constantly with the information that it's taking in to produce its course corrections and so on. So clearly, either a group of cells is constantly working, and within those cells, a set of genes is probably working too. Do you think there's any way to penetrate into that to see what the mechanism is?
I wish we could do that. It's not easy to study animals in the wild. I think you need to do modeling of what type of parameters are used and so on. And that has not extensively been done so far in this field, I would say, studying natural migrations. But certainly the timing program is central. And there's also expressions, but also the interactions with the magnetic field that you expect to meet en route can trigger some behavioral changes, for example, course shifts or fueling responses. It's certainly something which is inherited in the program, and we need to take this into account when we do the modeling. But in flight, they also the birds have to cope with the wind situations, and the winds could blow equally strong as they fly. So Certainly at some of the migration, long-distance migrations, they will fly maybe at 2,000-3,000 meters above the ground. And the question is, how do you actually know you're drifted? Because you're in a moving medium, and maybe you don't have sensory contact with the ground all the time. So it's certainly aspects here we don't understand, but maybe some modeling would be very useful.
Now, hasn't your group recently identified some regions of the genome that may be involved with navigation and migration?
Yes, I'm cooperating with a colleague, Staffan Bench, and we try to identify genes involved in encoding orientation in the willow warbler, which is one of the most common bird species in Sweden. And we have a migratory divide across Sweden, so we are able to explore this environment to study the possible differences in the genes between the population or different subspecies. And we can see there's very little differences, but there are some. And now we think we are on the way to try to nail down what type of genes are in fact involved in triggering the response to move southwest or southeast, as these two subspecies do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Åkesson.
Yeah.